This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Welcome to the Marvel Age Masterclass podcast with host Ben Morse. Episode 13, 1969, Part 1, with guest Todd Weber.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of Marvel Age Masterclass, hosted by me, Ben Morse, former editorial director of digital media at Marvel Comics for over a decade, and joined by a rotating cast of Place to Be Nation's Sarcastic Four. Easy for me to say. We're not talking Fantastic Four today, but I do have with me none other than the manager himself, Todd Weber. Good afternoon, sir.
Hello, how are you, Ben, in snowy Las Vegas? How are things?
You beat me to it. I was going to say I'm surviving here in snow-ravaged Las Vegas. The only place I've ever lived where less than an inch of snow sends an entire city into a panic, and suddenly everyone is just discombobulated and running around with their hair on fire. Have you ever experienced this, Todd? You've been on the West Coast longer than I have. Do West Coasters just have this aversion to weather? Granted, you don't live in the desert like I do where there's no weather, but it seems like people were woefully unprepared for this.
Yes, I live about an hour and a half from Lake Tahoe, and the closer you get to Tahoe, the stupider people drive, especially if they're just not around it very often. And But we want to play in the snow. We just don't want to deal with, oh my God, it's cold.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, for me, I'll confess that the night it snowed, I did freak out a little bit just because I was so not used to it. I've been so removed from it for a while. But rest assured, by the next morning when I walked my dog, and it was literally, there was a little snow on the roofs, there was a little snow in the trees, but otherwise the ground was perfectly clear. I went right back into East Coast, cynical, this is not snow, what's wrong with you people mode. So I swung pretty quickly.
Did anybody accuse, when it snows at Disneyland, oh, it's magic, it's them doing it? No, it's actually really snowing here. That doesn't happen very often, but in Vegas, it's all part of the show, folks.
That's what you would think. This is a town that's known for entertainment, for tricks. So yeah, no one accused this snow of being any sort of hoax. As I told you before we started recording, the biggest effect on me was as a college professor. Most of my students were outraged that I had class the next day. They thought I was putting them in danger by forcing them to drive in this weather. But again, I had very little tolerance, very little patience. Shocked by the small amount of cars I saw in the parking lot at work when I got there, and just generally underwhelmed by the reaction.
Ironically, your campus was filled with snowflakes.
Todd, that's why this is one of the many reasons I love having you on. We relate, man. We talk on the same level, and it's not just because we can record this on a Saturday afternoon as opposed to having to do it late at night or some other time to accommodate those East Coast guys.
Well, I'm certainly not going to besmirch my good friends on the East Coast and their lifestyle choices where they have not moved out west to where the living is easy. But no, I appreciate that it is refreshing to record in the middle of the day and or late at night when they're all at 3 in the morning.
Tucked in bed. Sure. Yeah, it's all good, man. Look, I've already insulted the West Coast people here saying they can't deal with snow. I might as well insult the East Coast as well and basically just make myself a man without a country, a soldier without a army. Yeah, I'm just going on my own here. I'm just striking out on my own as we set out to talk about Marvel Comics in the year 1969. Getting to the end of the decade, this is really interesting. We're getting to the end of the 60s. We'll hit on some of the social stuff, particularly when we get to talking about Spider-Man today, but we're on the verge of the 70s. Things are changing in the world. Things are changing in comics. I'm actually taking, as part of my grad school education right now, a 70s film and society class. This is backing up my general research because I'm doing a project that requires me to know about several different decades that I was not born in or familiar with, and the 70s is one of them. But as we hit the end of the 60s, what are some of the big things you notice as kind of trends in Marvel, things that are showing up in the books that maybe weren't there during the earlier part of the decade?
We're getting a little bit more of a social conscience, especially in the pages of Spider-Man, which we'll talk about later. That I think is the biggest event, or the biggest thing that I take out of these books. Also, we're winding down the Kirby years at Marvel, or at least the first Kirby run. And so I want to kind of look at what Jack was doing on Thor, and is it good? Is he phoning it in? Is there something going on? And I will definitely have opinions on that. But I think those are the two things. Plus the Steranko blip is done. We don't have Steranko this half of the year. We will see him in Captain America, which will be on a different show. But those are things I'm looking forward to with Marvel in the late 60s. I'm also curious to see, when does Roy Thomas have a Roy Thomas voice and not a Stan Lee rehashed voice? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, those are things to look out for. I think it's going to be, you know what, on a broader sense, it's going to be a lot of when do some of the other writers stop doing their best Stan Lee imitation and start actually writing. I'll argue that there is actually one example of that in the books we'll read today, which I had a very different opinion on one of the books than you guys did. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But it's interesting you bring up Kirby, because to me the thing that's so interesting is, when you look at it from a macro or more of a historical perspective, it's like, of course, Kirby was there forever. You know, he was a foundation of the Marvel Universe. But as we're coming up to the end of this first decade and getting ready to say goodbye to Kirby, it almost feels like the time flew by. I mean, I know it was 10 years or even a little less than 10 years, but it felt like it really went very quickly. It felt like he came in, was a huge creative force, did a lot, but wasn't around for as long as, I guess as a kid, it kind of, when I was thinking about time, it seemed like he was around a lot longer, because we will see him check out pretty soon. But as far as his work in this final year, let's talk about it real quick. Let's talk about Kirby's work on Thor, and I want to get your take on it, but I don't think he was phoning it in. To the contrary, I think he was starting to explore. And what I mean by that was he was starting to go outside of his comfort zone a little bit. I think even with Thor, that was always the book where he kind of pushed the boundaries the most. But in an echo of what he's going to be doing soon for other companies, he really started amping up the cosmic element. Marvel always kind of had the label, and I think Stan felt the most comfortable when they were doing kind of the everyman stories, the stuff about this could be a normal human just like you. And even Thor at first, as we've discussed on the show in the past, had the anchor of being Don Blake, had that tie to humanity that I can almost guarantee was probably a Stan idea, because that just seems like more of a Stan idea. In the Thor we read this time around, both in the big battle between Galactus and Ego, and then later on going into the origin of Galactus, this really felt like it was Kirby saying, okay, I'm done with this. Even on Fantastic Four, like a normal family, or drawing these characters who have the feet of clay, who are 1 foot on the earth. This is really him going, all right, Thor's the one guy where I can explore the universe. And literally, I mean, there are moments on Earth in these stories, but that feels like Stan kind of clinging to some bit of normalcy and humanity. For me, Kirby was ready to go off and chart the universe, and that's obviously what he spent a lot of the 70s doing. I think that Thor, and these Thor stories in particular, were very much a warm-up for that.
If you look at, the Eternals, the Celestials, you see the genesis of that art style, or some of those ideas in these Thor books. I don't think he's phoning it in at all. I just wanted to, kind of say, well, what if he was? This, I feel like Stan's not really doing much on this. I think this is kind of a case of Jack telling his story and Stan scripting, but I don't feel much Stan Lee story influence until maybe they get back to Earth a little bit in the middle of the year. But the big cosmic stuff, that's definitely Kirby. And I gotta say, Vince Colletta gets crapped on a lot as an inker, but I really like the way he works with Kirby in this particular run. I can remember reading, say, All-Star Squadron or books like that he was inking on, and it didn't look good to me. But it could have been of his time. This is really clean, especially on the award-winning Marvel Unlimited app. And I'm looking at it right now. So I like it. I like the line work of Colletta with Kirby and bold space, big panels with Ego, and we get another photo collage with Ego that's just fantastic, and I think it was 160 or 159. I gotta say, if I was reading this and in 1969, my head would be kind of blowing up a little bit. This is the time of Star Trek 2001, A Space Odyssey, and there's a lot of drugs going on in the pop culture, so maybe this is something that they were reading. I always think Thor is a book about father issues, and I say that all the time, but we don't get a lot of the Odin story at this part. We get it, I think, a little bit later in the year.
And that's another theme that we'll see Kirby come back to. You know, it's funny. I'm like skirting around talking about New Gods because my instinct on this show is like, oh, I don't want to jump too far ahead. But then I realized we're never going to talk about New Gods because obviously this is a Marvel show, not a DC show. But you see it in Kirby's DC work as well. It's all about fathers and sons. He keeps coming back to that, which is so interesting that is a theme. But yeah, you have a little bit of the Odin Thor stuff here, but really, I would almost argue Thor is an observer. He's the audience for most of these issues. And I think more and more that's what it felt like Kirby was doing. He's like, I have these big concepts I want to explore. I need a point of view character who's not going to be completely overwhelmed. Because if you put, Hank Pym in space, which they did eventually, it seems a little weird. He can't handle all these gigantic concepts, ironically enough. But you take someone like Thor, who is not of this world, something like Galactus is still big to him. Something like Ego is still special to him, but not so much, it's not the most insane thing he's ever seen. Growing up in Asgard, he has more of an affinity for stuff like this. So I do think, to your point, I think Stan was laying out a little on these. I think Stan had his books that he loved. I think FF was always kind of where they came together, but, Stan loved Silver Surfer. I think he loved doing Spider-Man. I think Thor, again, as we've said multiple times, it's really Kirby's baby, and I think he sees it as a vehicle to start doing what he wanted to do, which was he wanted to build his own universe. With the Marvel Universe, he got to help construct a universe, but with the stuff he has coming up, whether it's New Gods, whether it's Eternals, it really was him saying, I want to invent a mythology from the ground up. And I think that's what we see him doing here, particularly in the origin of Galactus, which I want to talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, well, we might as well work on that now. Did you find
Sure.
Galactus without the Silver Surfer to be not as compelling? Or say, you take him out of Fantastic Four, you throw him in Thor, and you tell his story, and it's a little bit about him. And I think we kind of checked out during the origin, and we being the Sarcastic Four. Just it kind of didn't ring true, or it just felt kind of like, well, this is not exciting at all. This is kind of like reading a Marvel Universe official handbook of the Marvel Universe entry about Galactus. It didn't quite have the emotion to it, and I guess Jack wanted to tell that story, and they tweaked the Galactus origin over the years, did they not?
Oh, absolutely. This is not the final version of the Galactus origin. We'll see John Byrne did a lot with it later on. Lots of creators tinkered with it. This is, at best, kind of a beta version of the Galactus origin.
I got to say, the covers are magnificent, though, especially...
Covers are amazing. The art's amazing. Visually, it's stunning. Visually, it's stunning. And that's why I think books like this will never completely dog on them. Like some books later in this podcast, we'll talk about just being bad or boring. The thing about a Jack Kirby book is, even if the story falls completely flat, which it rarely does, but even if it does, it's still going to look amazing. It's still going to look phenomenal. It's still going to look better than anything else that was on the stands at the time. So it gets a pass, like we're never going to say, oh, this was terrible, because even if we're skipping over, like you said, kind of the blocks of text, we still have these pretty pictures to look at. Would you say that's fair?
Okay, yeah, I'd say that's fair. And you know, Kirby's going to show you something different every episode, every issue, and it's inimitable. Nobody can do what he does. But you know, we're starting to see other artists, particularly in the second half of the year, when a particular X-Men artist comes onto the scene. Yeah. We're starting to see other people do impressive stuff, just kind of carving their own path and not necessarily aping Kirby. I think, to me, can you read the story and get the gist of it without even reading a dialogue box? And you can. That's what good art is to me. And sure. Kirby, what more needs to be said? Enough said about Kirby.
We've said plenty about Kirby, and we'll say more. I mean, he's coming back, and I hope when he comes back that we have more stuff on the list from him from his second run, because I'm not as familiar with his second Marvel run, and I would love to dig into that. His Captain America, his Black Panther, all his original creations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'd love to see more of that.
That's around the bicentennial, I think, around mid-70s.
Yeah. I will say this before we exit the Galactus stuff. I'm on the record as saying I think Galactus should have been in that first Fantastic Four trilogy and then never appeared again. I firmly feel that way. I feel that that was the most epic story you could do. It was Fantastic Four versus God. Fantastic Four wins. I think every time you bring Galactus back, it's diminishing returns. That's not to say other creators haven't done great Galactus stories. I think there are some excellent ones, but if I had my druthers, if I had my choice, he would have shown up, been defeated by a slim margin, and then never shown up again. He should have been in flashbacks in Silver Surfer, and that's it. And it's stories like this one, this Thor story, that honestly make my case for me, because I think once you start humanizing Galactus, once you start telling the story from his point of view, he's not as compelling to me. He's compelling to me when he's this unstoppable force, this beyond godlike creature who no one has a chance against. And putting the Fantastic Four against him and having them pull a rabbit out of their hat and having Silver Surfer have to kick in, just like that story had such impact that I don't hate this story, but I didn't like it. And not because it was poorly done, because again, looks great, and I don't think Stan was, failing on any level, but I just think it was a story that didn't need to be told. And yeah, I mean, mine's an extreme opinion, but I think you guys kind of got what I'm saying in the sense that with Galactus, less is definitely more.
Much like Russell and even Greg Phillips would say, Wolverine never needed his origin to be told. And then, there are people who will argue the opposite, but the less we know about the character, the more mystique that character has. But this is a case of, he was there. Let's tell a story with him. Let's try to get people to empathize with him just a little bit. And I don't feel it whatsoever. So, I do like later uses of Galactus in John Byrne's Silver Surfer, or his one shot. I do like him in Secret War, the very first Jim Shooter Secret War. But
sure,
I get your point. It'd be great. Has there ever been a character like that just made a tremendous impact, lost, and then was never heard from again?
So to me, the example of that was always the Anti-Monitor. He showed up one time, Crisis on Infinite Earths, took the entire DC universe to beat him, and then he's gone. And obviously in the last 10 to 20 years, he has come back a number of times. And I like those stories, but I'm of the same opinion there. I like it. And to answer your question, Todd, none jump to mind, because I think literally every good villain, even if the creators of that villain intended for them to be a one and done, at this point in comics, everyone has been brought back. If you look at any villain created specifically for an event, they make a big impact on their event, and then in subsequent stories just kind of, peter out. Galactus, because he's such a great character, people have found awesome stuff to do with him. I'm with you on Byrne. I'm with you on Secret Wars. I'm with you even to the modern day where Al Ewing had the run in Ultimates where he had Galactus basically reversing and becoming the Lifebringer. I thought that was clever. I thought that was a cool way to do something with Galactus, but would I trade all of that for him having just been this legendary, crazy villain that we never see again? I think there's something cool about that. And when you bring back a villain like that, I get it. You get the big moment, you get the big impact. Everyone remembers what a threat they were before. But I don't know. In an industry that has very little restraint, it would be nice to see some of it once in a while.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to take the idea that didn't work and tweak it till it becomes something that works. But ironically, if you take the idea that worked the first time and you keep using it and you're going back to the well, it doesn't work as well. But Jeff Johns did it with Infinite Crisis. He brought all the Crisis characters back, not just Anti-Monitor, but he brought the Superboy too. And then we got a big bad. So that was with a purpose in mind. But, you know, I think Galactus stands up because he's really, truly the first big boss, the first nth level threat in the Marvel universe.
In either universe, really.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean...
Because I can't think of a DC villain who was on this level at this point. Because I think of, like, goofy stuff like...
Starro.
Like when this... Starro, or even something like... Here, I'll throw an obscure one out for you because I just read it. Like the Nebula Man, who the Seven Soldiers fight when they come back in that JLA-JSA crossover. That's like a big cosmic villain, but it feels like a goofy Silver Age villain.
Right.
Galactus, to me, does not feel like a goofy Silver Age villain. It seems like, whoa, they really broke the mold when they came up with this guy. This is something special, and part of what makes him special is that he's so unique and we don't see him more than once, to me. So I think eventually, even though Galactus, again, because he has that great pedigree, you know, has succeeded in every time Galactus shows up, not every time, but a lot of times it feels like a big deal. I do think he's been watered down through the years. And again, to kind of bring it back to the point, I think this Thor story is kind of an example of Galactus being overused.
I do not disagree. I think we've made our point pretty well here. So, you know, if you compare it to DC at the time, it's not even fair, though, because DC...
No, not at all.
DC in 1960, the late 60s, was all about camp for the most part. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you were getting a little bit of social stuff in books like JLA, but until O'Neil Adams, there was nothing going on at DC that, to me, warrants going back and, hey, this is a great story, to me.
Right. No, I mean, I've compared Marvel and DC on this podcast very early on and said, you know, the stuff, I think when you read early Fantastic Four, you have to put it in the context of here's what DC was doing at the same time, reading those old Justice Leagues and Batmans and Supermans that were just so, as you said, campy and goofy, and just seeing what Lee and Kirby and Lee and Ditko were doing at Marvel makes even more impact. But I think that's when you look at, you know, a lot of the really great villains, like a Galactus, came from Marvel in the 60s. A lot of DC's best villains would also be created in the 60s, but would not be fully realized until the 80s at the earliest, when DC basically, and not to make this a DC podcast, but basically, you know, in the 80s, they go back and rethink everything. They do Crisis, and then everything's re-examined. And you get huge villains in books like New Teen Titans, you get Trigon, or even earlier, you get Darkseid in New Gods. And then you have this whole wave in the 80s, 90s, 2000s of old villains, like starting with Luthor and going all the way up to Sinestro and the Rogues, you know, being re-examined. And guys like Jeff Johns thinking, how can we make these goofy Silver Age villains a threat? But that's years off. And with Marvel, it feels like they kind of had to jump on that. Like their villains, even in the 60s, did feel like genuine threats. Galactus, Doctor Doom, the Spider-Man villains, these guys felt like real threats. They didn't feel like just some dude in a stupid costume. Some did. Some of the Spider-Man villains are terrible. The Wrecker. You know, a lot of any Thor villain who's not Asgardian generally comes off as just, you know, a goofy placeholder for the month. But there were a lot of really good villains, particularly in Fantastic Four and Spider-Man.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was an intentional. Each book was treated almost as its own universe. You know, you had everybody had their own rogues, and there was a lot of thought put into these characters. Hulk fought Gamma-based villains, like the Leader and Abomination.
Yep.
FF fought a lot of cosmic and a lot of their opposite numbers with characters like the Frightful Four, and you know, the big threats of Galactus and Annihilus eventually too. So I think there was a lot more thought as to these characters having their own opposite number, their arch villain, almost like you engineered a villain specifically for that character and why that guy would or girl would be a good complement, and you could tell long stories from the get-go. Very rarely do we see villains that were kind of one and done in this era. Mm-hmm. You had a cycle, a rotation of villains that would go in books like Spider-Man and Avengers even. So
yeah, I think that jumping off this before we do get into another book, I think that at the end of the day, the difference is the Marvel villains in the 60s were characters and DC villains in the 60s were gimmicks. Like, you look at the Flash's Rogues Gallery, who today are great because writers have gone in and really found out what made them tick and make them full characters. Back then it was just like, now this guy's a cold gun, this guy's a heat gun. Like, they all had gimmicks, and the gimmicks were what made the villains.
Being a guy who's reading through Who's Who in the DC universe because they just put it out on digital, I'm going through each one of those, and that was one of my things in the mid 80s. Then speaking of Kirby, there's a lot of great Kirby art in there. But boy, there were a lot of DC Mort villains of the Silver Age. Just really, what was the thinking there? It's almost like you throw a dart and you have this character generator that happens. We need this, and there was no real motivation or personal connection between the villain and the hero, which you try to see, or you see a lot more in Marvel, at least in the late 60s.
Absolutely. So let's jump over to another Marvel book where we had one of those great villains, and that's in Amazing Spider-Man, where we read kind of classic, like a sneaky classic two-parter, Crisis on Campus, where I remember they did kind of a loose adaptation of this on the animated series. It's definitely a story that's been paid homage, easy for me to say, paid homage to before, but basically the thrust of the plot is twofold. On the one hand, we've got some great Peter Parker stuff. He meets Robbie Robertson's son, for the first time. Randy is involved on campus. Obviously, Randy is black, and some of the other students who he's friendly with are having a protest because they don't want a building that's being sectioned off to be basically an alumni hotel. They want it to be for low-income housing for students who can't afford to live on campus. So they have a protest. Peter gets wrapped up in it. Robbie gets wrapped up in it. We get some racial politics. We get some societal politics. It's pretty heavy stuff for a 1969 comic book. And meanwhile, while all this is going on, Kingpin makes his return. This is when Kingpin is still very much a Spider-Man villain, hasn't made the transition over to Daredevil yet, and he's basically looking to steal an artifact that it's kind of a MacGuffin, and it will stay that way in Spider-Man for a little while. It's this ancient tablet which has unforeseen powers, and so you've got kind of these two stories butting up against each other. And I got to say, I was impressed by how Stan balanced the two. It would have been easy to make either one of these plots kind of very much the B plot, like either we're going to go heavy on the social issues, Kingpin's a background thing, or vice versa, to go heavy on the superhero action and the social stuff is really just window dressing. But I thought he did a nice job of doing a good superhero story that had plenty of fights and punching, but also made you think, and kind of what we were discussing before, had supporting characters who were not there just to, guess at Spider-Man's secret identity or to hound him in the press. These were characters who actually had some substance to them and actually had stuff going on in their own personalities.
Yeah, I love that we get Randy Robertson here, and I always call this the newspaper era of Spider-Man, just because growing up, my first, exposure to Spider-Man was the Sunday newspaper, where he had a 3-line comic strip, and it was done in a Romita style, although he didn't always do the art, but it still feels like that to me. And so this always calls back to it. His supporting cast was very strong, and it was based on college. So Peter is a college kid. Many of the people reading these comics are college kids at this point. And Peter, his early MO was to go up against villains who kind of represented his faculty, his mentors almost. And I guess you have kind of that same thing with the Kingpin, this rich, powerful man being contrasted against poor students, even though the two storylines didn't necessarily intersect like that. But
No.
And we also get the trope, the unforgettable trope of Kingpin is not fat; he's just very strong.
Brilliant.
I can't stop talking about that. It's classic.
It's amazing.
I want to co-opt it in my own life. I'm not fat.
These
I'm like
are muscles.
I'm like a sumo.
Yeah.
But yeah, what a classic story. The elephant in the room is the Vietnam War, which they don't talk about a whole lot, even though we know the draft card and little references are made to that, made to the culture of being drafted and going over. And, my dad served during Vietnam, and pretty much everybody who you talked to back then, it was touched by this. So, people are thinking about things, and it was kind of a gutsy move by Stan to bring social issues like this into comics when sometimes people want to just read comics and escape an adventure.
Right.
And here they're thinking a little bit, or at least, we're changing the character of Spider-Man to think about issues like this a little bit more. So, yeah, I think it's pretty great that it's something I can go back, and it's a very effective snapshot of 1969, at least what Marvel's version of 1969 was. Like, social issues are relevant and we want to read about them, or at least we're gonna have a point of view. And Stan always, we've talked a lot about Stan in the past couple months since he died. He was, I would say, a progressive even back then in his writing and in his editorials. And sometimes you don't think it's necessarily a progressive issue, but more of like a common sense thing, the way Stan would say stuff. But he was not shy about putting things that, some writers might be accused of being preachy, but I've never felt that in Stan's writing.
No.
I've never.
Yeah, that's the beauty of what Stan. Yeah, that's the beauty of what Stan does. And the beauty really comes from the fact that I think Stan knows how to put a point of view out there, but be respectful to everyone. A lot of people have accused him over the years of kind of just trying to cater to everybody. But I guess my question would be, why is that necessarily a bad thing? I think he just, when it came to stuff like this, he saw all points of view. Yes, I do think in his heart he was a progressive. Clearly, he leans on racial equality and kind of just a liberal way of thinking. I don't think there's any question. But he was always respectful. Now, I think of it in today's climate where we have such a divided, in terms of social ideology, world where everyone wants to argue with everyone else. Stan wasn't about that. Stan wasn't about shoving his point of view down your throat, to what you were saying, Todd. He was about trying to really educate people and potentially bring them over to his way of thinking. He was very persuasive and he was very clever. And I think contrasting what we were talking about with Kirby, Kirby was going all in on that, what you were talking about, the escapism of comics, making them larger than life adventures that had really nothing to do with the real world. And that's fine. That's a perfectly valid way to do comics. And some of the best comics ever come out of thinking. But I think Stan is starting to, I don't know if he necessarily wants to address the real world stuff. I don't know, but I think he recognized, like you said, Vietnam was dominating the audience that was reading these comics, and to not at least touch on some of this stuff, I think he would have felt like he was doing a disservice. So it's interesting because I think you see, half a decade earlier, Stan and Jack coming together because they just want to create great comics. And we get Fantastic Four from that. And I think now, years into their association, we're seeing them branch off in different directions, where Jack really wants to go full bore on the sci-fi comic side, and then Stan, discounting the fact that he's writing stuff like Silver Surfer, is really leaning into, okay, we know he was out there, we know he was doing college speaking tours. I think he was interested in having his characters inhabit the real world, and he did have something to say.
I do also think, getting back to the supporting cast, Gwen is really given time to shine in this storyline. We get to see how far she's come instead of just the damsel in distress or the party girl. She's a very strong character. You see a lot of it in her discussions with her father. Did anything ever become of that MacGuffin tablet, that clay tablet with the secrets of the ancient world?
So here's where I start getting confused, because on the cartoon, it stuck around for like a whole season, and they kept coming back to it. And that was, they did a lot of stuff with Silvermane. And I want to say that also happened in the comics. I do think that Silvermane eventually gets his hands on this tablet and becomes like all the street level criminals are going after it. So it becomes, you get your Silvermanes and your Kingpins, all these guys trying to go after it. And it did, I want to say this was the MacGuffin that, if you guys are familiar with Silvermane, transformed Silvermane from an old man into a little kid for a little while. I'm pretty sure this is what did it, but I don't know. I'm a little foggy on it. I can't say that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a big deal right now, but I don't remember it being anything that had any lasting impact on the Marvel U.
Look, it's not the friggin' Infinity Gems, stones. It's not the Infinity Stones. It's not going to come back and be the subject of like a major event crossover. It's not going to be the weapon that everyone looks for every time there's a big cosmic threat. But I do think there are like at least 2 or 3 more stories in Spider-Man specifically that deal with this tablet and its weird capabilities.
I like how the end of the Crisis on Campus / Kingpin and the tablet ends up in the Spider-Man trope of him. I've had enough of this. I'm looking out for number 1 kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
Which we've seen so many times over the years where you think, oh, there's this dramatic turnaround in his character, and then something will happen halfway through the next issue where it'll be, oh wait, no, I've got to be responsible. I've got to I've got to get Aunt May her medicine.
Oh God, I don't even want to talk about Aunt May during this run. No, it's fine. You're fine. I'm just saying, like, I have no plans to bring it up because I'm just like, Aunt May was the least boundary pushing part of this comic to me in the 60s. It was, I think honestly, she has become such a better character in recent years, even like pushing forward, but she was just such an albatross in the 60s and 70s, really just such a plot device of, well, how can we make Spider-Man's life a little bit harder? I really, it's not till really the 2000s that writers like Straczynski start really making her kind of the backbone, and we get the whole, I think a lot during, I can bring this up because you're not Nick. I can say during Dan Slott's run, I thought they did a good job of kind of saying, you know what? Peter didn't learn all of his morality from Uncle Ben. Aunt May was a pretty big part of that. And good stuff with her later on, but she is decades away from being anybody I want to read about.
I seem to recall Peter David and J.M. DeMatteis. Did I say it right?
Yep.
Hey,
I think so.
There you go. Well, I know we get into that again. I'm sorry. Did some things with her that humanized her, or at least gave the character a little bit more dimension. But
for sure.
But yeah, I agree with you. Straczynski was more of an interesting take on the Aunt May character. I mean, she was basically his mother from forever.
Well, I mean, also, I guess we got to give credit to Brian Bendis for reimagining her in the Ultimate Universe, which I think is kind of where the inspiration to actually do something with Aunt May came from. I think that was probably the genesis. Enough about Aunt May. And honestly, you know what? Enough about Spider-Man. No, stop apologizing. enough about Spider-Man this time around. I thought it's a good 2 issues. Stan's really hitting his stride. I think Kirby's hitting his stride in one way. Stan's hitting his stride in his other way. The interesting thing in 69 is that we're starting to see them go in different directions and both be successful in completely different ways. Any other thoughts on Spider-Man before we move on?
No, Romita, solid as ever. I mean, you get.
Of course, I didn't even bring
what you expect. Yeah, you get what you expect from these books, and we're kind of heading towards Spider-Man 100. We've been at Spider-Man for a long time.
For a lot of issues of Spider-Man, no doubt.
A decade. Yeah. So wrapping up the 60s.
Yeah, very cool. So good stuff from Spider-Man, good stuff from Thor. All right, here's where we get into the part of the podcast where it's not all roses and sunshine. Obviously, you guys had a pretty harsh take on the issue of Marvel Superheroes we read where the original Guardians of the Galaxy were introduced. Do you want to quickly sum up kind of the Sarcastic Four's collective take on Guardians for folks who may not have caught that? And by the way, this is the point during the show where I remind you guys, if you're not listening to the Marvel Age podcast, why are you listening to this show? We are supplementing things that are already being said on Marvel Age. So please go listen to the Marvel Age episode and come back and listen to this. But give me the short version of how you guys felt about the Guardians.
Why do we care about this? What is there any compelling hook to this character, these characters, specifically Charlie, who kind of dominated the book? I think we weren't able to put ourselves into why would this be an interesting book in 1969. And I mean, it's not like it was a hit, but they kept the Guardians around for years. So we didn't quite get it. We didn't think that Gene Colan was the best artist to introduce the look of the Guardians. And, you know, I said before, this was 1969's 2001 A Space Odyssey was a huge part of the culture. Star Trek was a somewhat big part of the culture. People were thinking about optimistic futures. You know, Star Trek presented that. The Legion of Superheroes at DC presented that. And this is them maybe thinking about some ways to get some time travel aspects, or let's tell the future story of Marvel. I don't know. I mean, I sometimes we get these one-off characters or these backdoor pilots that work out and they turn into series, and sometimes they don't. And the Guardians were kind of B-listers for a long time at Marvel.
I think calling them B-listers is being generous. They were definitely probably C-list at best. I mean, I guess they did show up in Avengers and they did have their own series in the 90s, but all good points. And I like what you said, and you brought up a lot of stuff I want to touch on. I dug this. I dug this first appearance of the Guardians, and I'll tell you why, is because I did kind of put myself back in the frame of, all right, it's 1969. I thought about the Legion. I thought about Star Trek. I didn't think so much about 2001, but I did think about those takes on. It was very much, hey, the future is this almost utopian, wonderful place. Legion is full of bright colors and happy people. And don't get me wrong, I love the Legion of Superheroes. It's one of my favorite franchises. And I think it's one of those books that actually, when we talk about Silver Age DC, Legion was probably one of the best books of the 60s. Like, because it was bright and sunny and optimistic, and that's what it was meant to be. So some of the camp and goofy elements didn't feel so out of place. And I just love the costumes and the characters and the powers. I think it's a great concept. What I dig about Guardians of the Galaxy is you have to imagine here today, 2019, dystopian futures are a go-to trope of fiction. Everyone wants to talk about these horrible futures where, you know, we've been conquered by aliens, or pollution has destroyed the planet, or all these bad things are happening. I would argue in 69, that was not so much of a thing. You were seeing a lot more stuff like Star Trek, where the future was seen as, you know, it was a dangerous place, but ultimately we had the glory and beauty of the exploration of the universe, and things were good, and humanity was prospering, and we were going out there and, you know, making contact with other races, and it was exciting to see what was out there. Guardians is not that. The original Guardians is a dark take on what could happen if we make contact with an extraterrestrial race. Earth has been overrun. It has been conquered. I get that the Badoon were not the most imaginative alien race in the Marvel Universe. Maybe it would have worked better. They'd used the Kree or the Skrulls. Regardless, I like this take on the fact that not everything is bright and shiny. Like, this is a very scary future, but we're getting this infusion of hope. I will say I agree with you guys. In this first issue, we don't necessarily get reasons to care about Charlie or Vance Astro or these characters who are kind of ciphers. And, you know, Arnold Drake as a writer, I don't think fully has a handle on making these guys three-dimensional characters yet. But I admire the attempt to do something different, to create this super challenge where, you know, the Marvel Universe is this place where we're used to good triumphing over evil in the end. You know, at the end of the day, Spider-Man or the FF or Thor, they're going to win. They're going to beat back the bad guys. Look, we were just talking about Galactus. And Guardians of the Galaxy, at least initially, is a story where the bad guys have very much won. And again, that's something we would see a lot in the decades following, but this is really one of the first times we saw that. It certainly was not a thing explored in other comics that had come before this. And I'm not going to argue by any stretch that Guardians of the Galaxy is as groundbreaking as something like Fantastic Four in terms of doing something that hadn't been done before. But I do think there was an element of, this is something new, this is something different, and I didn't think the quality was so horrible that I wasn't going to give it a chance. So I was, if nothing else, I was intrigued by it.
Yeah, to me, it's not that different from Captain Marvel at the time, trying something different, trying something new. Is there any reference to the Marvel universe other than the Badoon in this? Is there anything that
I don't think so.
it? Or
no.
Because
that would have helped. That would have helped, to be honest. Yeah, that would have helped to kind of give some context. I get it. I don't compare it to I get what you're saying with the Captain Marvel comparison in the sense that, yeah, it's something different. But I think Captain Marvel was just so throwing darts at a board and, seeing what might work, kind of like you were talking about with DC villains earlier. It's just like, he's alien and he's this. And I just thought Captain Marvel was a bunch of ideas piled on one another. With Guardians, I think it's a simple concept. It might seem a little complicated, but to me it's a simple concept. Aliens took over and we're struggling to keep humanity alive. It's something we would see in so many movies, so many comics, everything. Like this idea of like the band of freedom fighters who are trying to overcome this evil empire. I mean, look at something like Star Wars. But this was the first time I think we had seen it in Marvel. And really in superhero comics to date. Superhero comics were always kind of, by default, even the quote-unquote darker ones like Batman or Spider-Man, they were kind of, optimistic in the end. And I think Guardians was not necessarily optimistic. By the end of this issue, I don't think you have a set sense that the Guardians of the Galaxy, I don't think, are they even named in this issue? Or are they just four characters?
I don't think they use Guardians, but...
I don't think they use Guardians, but you don't have the sense like, oh, these characters have it all wrapped up. They're going to win. You still have it's four characters against an entire alien race who have carved out a galactic empire. Like, this is very much the beginning of what's going to be a long struggle. And I just, I think there's something cool to that. And I've always liked the character of Vance Astro for reasons we'll get into years from now. But I like I think that's a cool idea of this guy who gets, he leaves Earth and thinks he's going to go on this fantastic journey and comes back and it's years in the future and everyone he's ever loved is dead. Like, there's something to that. Martin X and Yondu really are just visuals at this point and nothing more. Charlie, I'll agree with you guys. To me, Charlie 27 is never going to be my favorite character. But I will also say, the stuff you guys didn't like about the Colan art, it worked for what I was into. Because Colan was such a dark, foreboding artist. Like, he would do his best work on stuff like Dracula coming up.
Yep.
And just the fact that Doctor Strange, just the fact that he could create this portrait of tomorrow that was not the Legion's utopia, that did seem like, oh crap, things are bad. Like, I mean, I could think of something that comes years later, like Days of Future Past. To me, this initial Guardian story is closer to something like that than it is to something like Star Trek or the Legion.
Do you read pages or do you read panels?
I read pages. I don't have the patience to read panels.
Okay. Page layouts or panel layouts in this are very interesting. There's not grids per se. There's pentagons and very interesting, kind of intentional, I would say. Colan's doing something a little different with these stories. It was hard for me to follow the first time I read this book. The second time I looked through, okay, I get it a little bit better. And especially when I switched to pages, it was a little, okay, I see what he's going for. I don't think they give the fine character of Vance Astro justice here.
Well done. Very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very nice. Well, I mean, ultimately, I don't think I'm going to win you guys over on Guardians of the Galaxy, but I did want to, give it a chance to kind of give my alternative view. I liked it. I would like to see more of these characters. I've always been kind of fascinated with the original Guardians. I've gone back and read the 90s series by Jim Valentino.
Right.
And it's fun. It's not the greatest stuff in the world, but what you said, once they do once they go all in on this is the Marvel Universe idea, that it does become a little more like, okay, now we're seeing what happened to Captain America, what happened to the Punisher, and all this stuff. And even when they come back and interact with Avengers, obviously that's where they were probably headed. So you need to have a little patience to get to that. It will become Marvel Universe eventually, and that is interesting. But, I didn't hate this first issue, and I would urge people who maybe listened to Marvel Age and thought this was no good, if you decide not to read it, give it a try. Your mileage may vary.
Yeah, that was literally what I was going to say about Guardians. It doesn't get good until it becomes the future of the Marvel Universe, and you get to see the Phoenix Force and things like that. And even then, I wouldn't say it was necessarily great. I would say it was 90s comics, but it was style. It had a style to it. When earlier in the show you talked about having a different point of view or a different opinion about one of the books, I was worried you were going to talk about the Incredible Hulk annual or Incredible Hulk King Size special. So.
No. It was Guardians, man. Guardians was the one where I zigged where you guys have zagged. We're gonna talk about how bad Hulk is in just a second. Do you wanna talk about how bad Hulk is now?
No. I was just worried. I was not expecting you to have a dissenting opinion on Guardians. So that's interesting.
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, look, I've also always had an affinity for the Marvel cosmic stuff. There's something to it that I really like. I always have. Nova was my favorite character as a kid. I've always been very into the idea of outer space in the Marvel universe. So I guess I was predisposed to like this. But yeah, no, I did like this, and it was enough. I think it was the first thing I read this month for this podcast was Guardians or Marvel superheroes, and I don't know, it just stuck with me. And when I heard you guys on the show, I'll say this: I wasn't shocked you guys didn't like it. I kind of was like, I don't know if they're going to dig it that much. But listening, I was like, oh well, I definitely have a different opinion on this.
On the app, if we can talk about Marvel superheroes as a title. This is the last issue of that comic book represented on Marvel Unlimited I think. So was the book primarily reprints after this, or just nothing notable was introduced in this book at that point?
I think it's the latter. I think nothing notable was introduced. I think, these at this point, the anthology titles were kind of being done away with. Like your Tales of Suspense was becoming Captain America, Tales to Astonish was becoming Hulk. They were focusing more on characters. So I think you get something like this, and then what was the book that Captain Marvel debuted in? Was that also Marvel Superheroes?
I believe it was. Yeah, it was Marvel Superheroes also.
So Marvel Superheroes, they were trying some stuff out here, but I think when you look back, and we can maybe do some research and come back to it when we do the second half of 69, just to touch on it quickly. It'd be interesting to look up and see what was introduced in Marvel Superheroes after this. I don't think, and I could be wrong, I don't think the Guardians stick around as like a recurring feature. I think they're just kind of like introduced and then they're used again later in other books, but I could be wrong about that. So let's, little homework assignment. We'll look up what happened to Marvel Superheroes after this, because I do know it was around, I think, for a little bit longer, but I don't know if they stopped introducing new characters, or I don't know what happened to it.
I only knew of the Guardians as a kid because they were in books like the Marvel Fun Book and, these non-comic but out there books about comics, Foom and things like that. They would make reference because you're always trying to get your characters over any way you can. So I knew who Charlie was and Nikki was. She was a character at that point. But I had never actually read any of the classic run. I read a couple of the the originals. I had read some of the Valentino, but it's the Abnett and Lanning Guardians that's my jam.
Right. I mean, I think that's the case for most people, is that they took and it's funny because I was there when Abnett and Lanning launched Guardians, and the sense around Marvel at the time was Abnett and Lanning, and before them Keith Giffen, have kind of revitalized Marvel Cosmic, and they've made these characters like Star-Lord, like Drax, like Gamora. They're interesting now, and we should do something with them. There's a pretty sharp divide when, I believe it was Bill Roseman, who was an editor at the time, and it was like the main editor behind Annihilation after Andy Schmidt, who did the original. And Bill basically, he was the guy editing Nova, editing Guardians, editing Annihilation Conquest, War of Kings, all that stuff. Works in Marvel Games now, but great guy, visionary guy, and I think he was the one who said if we're gonna, because they said coming out of Annihilation Conquest, the big thing was we have the solo, we want to do a team book. What are we going to call it? And you may remember that at some point they came out with a book called Annihilators. That was the working title for Guardians of the Galaxy. Star-Lord and his crew was Annihilators because they wanted to use the Annihilation branding and name. Mm-hmm. And someone, I don't know if it was Abnett and Lanning, I don't know if it was Roseman, someone kicked the idea of using Guardians of the Galaxy. It's a cool name. Yes, this has nothing to do with the original concept, but no one really cares about the original concept. And the thought behind that was, on the one hand, yeah, it's a cool name and we own the copyright, so we should do something with it. On the other hand, people were very nervous that people would hear Guardians of the Galaxy and be like, oh no, like those characters, and it would be a negative association. Yeah, so yeah, there was very much, I think, in Marvel. I remember it was definitely like an uphill battle to get Guardians of the Galaxy approved as the title of the book. I remember, like, literally probably a month before, it was still being called around the office. It was being called Annihilators, which I hated. I did not like Annihilators as a name at all. I thought it sounded so stupid. And I was like, and that ties it to Annihilus, which is the whole point of why Annihilation was called Annihilation. And, like, you got to address that. So I liked that they did Guardians of the Galaxy. And then, of course, it's interesting that, yeah, now Guardians of the Galaxy, when people think about it, they think about Star-Lord, they think about Drax, Gamora, Groot, Rocket, those characters. No one thinks about Charlie 27 and Advanced Astro. And it's been kind of interesting watching, both in the comics and in the films, them slowly bring in elements of the original Guardians as kind of like a tribute. And people, you know, casual fans having no idea that this actually came. You know, Starhawk was around before Star-Lord, so that's interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting because we had the conversation. The Sarcastic Four didn't necessarily know that those characters were the original Guardians, or at least you know, translated into these characters. You know, Martin X was in there. Starhawk, who comes later in the Guardians tales, and then Nikki, of course, in Charlie X. Charlie X is a Star Trek character. Charlie 27, there we go. Yeah, I think that's all I have, other than the Abnett and Lanning did tie in eventually to the you know, they wrote them in the second year where they had the Ghost crew.
Yeah, I think they felt like they had to. I think they were like, if we had, just knowing Dan and Andy, they're such Marvel nerds that I think they were like, if we have a book called Guardians of the Galaxy and we don't eventually do something with the people they thought of as the real Guardians of the Galaxy, well, we're not really doing our jobs. So we'll talk. I don't know when we'll talk more about Guardians of the Galaxy, to be honest. I don't know if they come back into this reading list for a while. But let's finish up on something we all agree on, and that is that there were way too many issues of Hulk that we had to read this month. Just brutal. Really rough stuff. I'll say the one thing I may have diverged with you guys a little on is I like Herb Trimpe's art. I think it has a power and an energy to it, but just so dull in terms of pacing, storytelling, everything. Hate the supporting cast. Betty Ross is hard to deal with. General Ross is not what he would become. Talbot is a joke. And then the leader, just not the most imaginative villain at the time. I'll be fully transparent, Todd. I did not read the annual.
You didn't miss much.
I listened to you guys do it because when I went to look it up on Marvel Unlimited, I looked up Incredible Hulk Annual and couldn't find it. I didn't realize that it was Giant Size Hulk or Hulk Giant Size
Special,
or whatever.
Right.
King Size Special or whatever the hell it was called.
Right.
So I just said, you know what? I've read enough Hulk this month. I'm not going to go seeking out more. So you can talk a little bit about that. But, man, I just like – here's my thoughts on Hulk. We've delved into this that we know Hulk eventually works, right? Hulk is eventually going to be a big success. He's one of the most popular characters in comics. He's one of the most popular characters in Marvel. But obviously – had some serious growing pains, some real start and stop. His initial series was a bust, worked as a guest star and a villain, and now they're bringing him back, and I think there was this thought that, okay, his second run is where he really shines, and thus far it's not the case, and I have a theory on why that is that kind of aligns with some of the stuff you guys said, but I'll let you say your piece, and then I'll jump into that.
So, yeah, I think they were just trying to find a consistent groove on this. They've got the supporting cast. And we don't have a ton of Rick Jones. We still have Rick Jones. We have Betty being very predictable, daughter of the villain kind of thing, daughter of the antagonist, which is, we've seen that trope in movies and in books forever. But Hulk himself, Banner stuff is, what you're going to get. And unfortunately, it's just not compelling at this point. There's nothing, I don't get why people would read this. Am I getting into this? I don't feel sorry for this character necessarily. He's not doing anything terribly heroic. He's just kind of misunderstood. He happens, he's being picked on because he can't control things. I said my affection for Hulk comes from things like the 1982 Incredible Hulk cartoon on NBC, which basically was this run kind of updated with the military against Hulk chasing around. But Hulk was a success because the TV show was great.
There you go. You jumped into it before I even got a chance to say it.
No, that saved the character.
Yeah, not to jump too far ahead, but that is, I think, honestly, they stumbled backwards into how the Hulk worked because they were doing a TV show, and because the special effects budget probably wasn't what it was, they had to do a show mostly about Banner, where the Hulk showing up was special. And then the guys writing the comics realized, that's what works. If we make it 85% Banner and 15% Hulk, and when the Hulk shows up, it's a big deal, that can work. We look at these issues, it's still Hulk, 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 Hulk. Banner's a non-factor. It's not about this guy kind of running away from this curse. It's more about the monster. And the monster's interesting in small doses, but we don't want to read 5 issues about him and about him fighting the leader, who's just really not that interesting. So I think you nailed it. Until we get to the TV show, which doesn't come to the late 70s, so we got like another decade, I don't think the Hulk's going to get good. And, I haven't read all these old Hulk stories, but that's what I'm taking away from reading all this stuff, is that the most interesting thing about Hulk is that they hung on to it for so long. Yeah. And they just kept the confidence that at some point this would get good was remarkable. And I'd love to, if we could still talk to him today, I would love to have talked to Stan about what it was about Hulk that he had such an affection for. Because obviously this was a character that he or people working for him kept bringing back and trying to make work time and time again. And obviously not every character is like that. There are some that are kind of, they flop and they give up on him and you never see him again. But with Hulk, they always gave Hulk another shot. And to their sheer insistence and stubbornness, he eventually got over. But there's a lot of bad stuff, and we had to read a lot of bad stuff this month.
Herb Trimpe drew this book for over 6 years.
Dude, I like Herb Trimpe. I'm
not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying I admire that longevity.
He had a good long run, and I remember, who's like the number one Herb Trimpe fan, which is super interesting, is Rob Liefeld.
Because of G.I. Joe, or
I don't know why. I just know that Rob Liefeld on Twitter and stuff is always singing the praises of Herb Trimpe. And what's interesting about that is that in the 90s, they basically told Herb Trimpe to draw more like Rob Liefeld.
Yeah, that's funny.
If you look at any Trimpe stuff from the 90s, it's awful, number one, and it's just like it's him doing a bad Liefeld imitation. And it's just always been interesting to me that those two are kind of linked in the sense that they told Trimpe to be more like Liefeld, and the irony is Liefeld wished he could draw more like Trimpe, probably. So it's just interesting stuff. But honestly, man, I don't want to linger on this show. I try to focus on the interesting stuff that we're going to have good discussions about, and then kind of sail past things like Incredible Hulk. So unless you got more to say, we can bring this to a close.
Yeah, I don't have much. I mean, Hulk was maybe, if you scan the issues of Hulk, you see, okay, here's big guest star, here's big super team he's going up against. I wonder if when he joins the Defenders, if that's a more compelling version of Hulk. In
just having him butting up against other characters,
right,
maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
But
I do think he works better as part of the Marvel Universe than necessarily as the focal point.
But boy, I love me some Peter David Hulk, and I
oh god,
I enjoyed
so
the
good.
John Byrne run too. You know,
yeah. I mean, again, we'll get to that, and I think an important point that you already made, Todd, is those books came out post TV series, and I think that is a huge difference, as we will see.
Yeah, Marvel's TV sensation, The Incredible Hulk, whose comic book did not resemble the TV show, but they changed it a little bit, maybe, you know, made him the Wanderer. But boy, the TV show really worked. As a kid, it was something that, you know, he was even on the Mr. Rogers show. Mr. Rogers had to talk about the Hulk. That's what a big impact.
That TV show saved it, man, in the same way that, I mean, honestly, the Batman TV show in the 60s saved Batman. Batman was going nowhere till then, and it's so funny because the Batman that we commonly associate does not bear much resemblance to the 60s TV show, but in both cases, those are examples of characters we think of being instantly successful being kind of saved by their TV incarnations.
And the beginning of comics being an IP farm for, you know, bigger media. And, you know, well, that's why comics are around. So we'll take a...
So thank you.
Yeah.
We'll take it. All right, man. Well, that is the first half of 1969. Some good stuff today. I'm glad we get to have the Guardians discussion. I think we had some interesting things to say about all the books. Todd, until we see you next time on part 2 of 69 here on Masterclass, where can people find you?
At Todd Weber Guitar on Twitter, where you will see me passive-aggressively go off on fellow bandmates and people I work on podcasts with and all kinds of stuff, as well as political takes and sports takes.
Right.
Join the Place to Be Nation comics group, where I tend to be the guy who tries to beat Russell Sellers to posting news about the comics world. But we have good discussions. We talk about all of our shows there. Guitars of Green on Twitter, on Instagram, on the IG, you will see pictures of my dogs in my Hawaiian shirts. I don't have a lot of recording projects coming on, but there are lots of great shows here on Place to Be Nation Pop that I am involved in production and scheduling, etc. of.
Yeah, you make it all work. You hold it all together. You can find me on Twitter as Ben J. Morse, on Instagram as Ben Morse882. I've been doing a lot of talking about comics lately, so if you want to hear or see more of that, definitely that's a place. And I would say just pay attention to everything that's going on the PTBN Comics feed. Listen to all the great shows, Hard Traveling Fanboys, Talking Pop, Post-Crisis Management, everything. And be sure to tune in to the next episode of Marvel Age before you come back here for another installment of Marvel Age Masterclass. So with that, we will say goodbye. I am going to go and, wander out into this Arctic wasteland, Todd, and see if I can get by at these sub-zero temperatures. But I wish you all the best. I'll talk to you again soon. Until next time, class dismissed.
Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
PlayStation Nation's Justin Rosero and Chad Campbell here, and we want to let you know that we have a ton of great podcasts available to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and PlayStation.com, and we now offer them to you on 2 great feeds. On the PlayStation Wrestling feed, we bring you the Mothership, the Place to Be podcast, Main Event, Survey Says, Wrestling Warzone, a Monday Night Wars podcast retrospective, No Holds Barred, Jeff Learns Wrestling, and our monthly pay-per-view reaction shows. On top of that, we're also dipping into the vault, re-releasing the entire catalog of where the big boys play for your enjoyment. And in addition to these full-length shows, we also deliver special network pod blasts on topics old and new.
The Place to Be Nation Pop feed is loaded with great content, offering such tremendous shows covering the land of pop culture, such as Geek and Sassy, Talkin' Pop, the Glenn Butler Podcast Hour Spectacular, Sunday Groove, PTBN Play, Freak Out Drive-In, Songs with Friends, Looking Forward, Looking Back, and Lucha Undead, as well as a veritable podcast heaven for comics fans with the hard-traveling fanboys, Sellers Points, Conversation Comics, DC Post-Crisis Management, Marvel Age, and Marvel Age Masterclass, plus weekly pod blasts that cover the gamut of comic topics. The feed is also filled with insightful sports content, including the NBA team, This Week in the NFL, and more.
And you can find all these current shows, plus archives of our past podcasts, including The Kevin Kelly Show, as well by subscribing to both feeds on iTunes. And while there, be sure to rate and leave feedback as well. All of these shows, plus others available at PlayStation.com. We cover pro wrestling, sports, movies, comics, in-depth stretch projects, and more. Be sure to support our site by using PlayStation.com/Amazon while doing your online shopping. And download our free PTB Vintage Vault Refresh ebooks via the links on our site. We also want to thank our friends at Boneheads Wing Bar, ProWrestlingOnly.com, and TheHistoryOfWrestling.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr as well. PlayStation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.